He vowed he would never mark me, treating our sacred bond like a curse. Now, he is searching every room of the pack house, desperate for a scent that has already faded. He chose his ego over our instinct, and now he has to sleep in the bed he made, alone. I found out I was getting married from my mother over the phone. The way you would tell someone the plumber was coming on Tuesday. The choice has been agreed, she said. JL's father wants the ceremony within the month. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, staring at a pot of water that had just started to boil, thinking how strange it was. The whole shape of my life could change in the time it took noodles to cook. I didn't ask if I loved him. I didn't ask if he loved me. I already knew the answer to both, and I already knew it didn't matter. The morning of the wedding, my hands wouldn't stop shaking as my aunt pinned the last fold of my hanbok. She kept clicking her tongue at me, like my nerves were an inconvenience to her sewing. "You're lucky," she said. "Do you know how many omegas would kill for the Choi name?" I wanted to tell her that a name isn't the same thing as being wanted, but I just nodded because my throat had gone too tight to argue. I saw Choi JL properly for the first time at the altar, and my chest did something humiliating. It lifted just slightly at the sight of him. He was beautiful in the specific, severe way alphas from old families always are, like his features had been arranged by committee. But it was his eyes that undid me. Dark, sharp, and completely, utterly empty when they landed on mine. He didn't smile. He didn't do anything. He just looked at me the way you'd look at paperwork you hadn't finished reading yet. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself a lot of things that day. The reception blurred into flashing cameras and relatives I'd never met congratulating me on my good fortune. JL stood beside me for every photo, his hand resting at the small of my back like it belonged there. And every time his fingers pressed a fraction closer, my heart would stutter stupidly, hopefully, like it hadn't gotten the memo that hope wasn't part of this arrangement. By the time we were finally alone, standing in the bedroom of a house I didn't recognize as mine, the mask he'd worn all day for the cameras had already come off. "Let's be clear about something," he said. He hadn't even taken off his jacket yet. He said it the way you'd read out terms of a contract, flat, efficient, already bored of the conversation. "This marriage happened because my father is dying and needed the merger settled before the board smelled weakness. It has nothing to do with you." "I know," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "Then you'll understand when I say I won't be marking you." His jaw tightened, just barely, like the sentence cost him something to say. "I won't be touching you at all if I can help it. The moment my father no longer needs this, the moment the board stops watching, this ends." "Do you understand?" I understood. I understood in the way you understand a slap before you feel the sting of it. "I understand," I said. He looked at me for a long moment then, longer than he needed to, for someone who just told me he wanted nothing from me. His gaze dropped briefly to my throat, to the bare, unmarked skin there. And something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't name. Then it was gone, like a door closing. "Good," he said, and walked out to the balcony, leaving me alone in a bedroom built for two people who would apparently never be one thing to each other. I stood there for a long time after he left. I remember unbuttoning the ceremonial jacket with hands that wouldn't quite cooperate, folding it over the back of a chair because some old habit in me still wanted everything to look neat, presentable, worthy of the house I'd been placed in. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone. "You're lucky." I thought about the way his hand had felt at my back during the photographs, warm, solid, real, and how it meant nothing at all, how it had probably meant nothing to him even as it was happening. I unpacked my single suitcase into the closet on what I already understood to be my side of the room, though there was nothing yet to suggest there was a his side that would ever meet it. I hung up shirts I'd chosen carefully, thinking foolishly about what he might like, and then felt embarrassed at myself for the thought. Outside, I could hear him on the balcony, the quiet click of a lighter, the low exhale of smoke into the night air. He didn't come back in. I climbed into the bed alone, on my side, leaving more space than necessary between the pillow beside me and my own, as if his absence needed room to be official. I lay there a long time listening to the city outside, cars, distant laughter, someone's music through a thin wall, and told myself this was simply what a marriage like mine would look like. Room shared, name shared, nothing else. I didn't cry. I want that on record, even now. I didn't cry that first night. I just lay very still, staring at the ceiling of a house that wasn't mine, married to a man who had already told me, in his own careful, deliberate way, exactly how little I would ever mean to him. I had no way of knowing yet how much worse it would get before I finally stopped waiting for it to get better. By the second week, I had learned the shape of his absence better than the shape of him. I learned that he left the house at 6:40 every morning. That he took his coffee black with no sugar, and that he hated when the household staff spoke to him before he'd had his first cup. I learned all of this not because he told me, but because I watched, quietly, the way you learn the habits of a stranger you're desperate to understand. I told myself I was just trying to make things easier. That was the lie I fed myself every morning I got up before dawn to have his coffee ready before he came downstairs. The staff had clearly been given some kind of instruction about me, though no one ever said it outright. I noticed it in small things. The way Auntie Park, who ran the kitchen, would answer my questions politely but never warmly, like she'd been told not to get attached to something temporary. I noticed it when JL introduced me to his father's business partner at the door, and simply said, "This is the arrangement my father mentioned," instead of my name. The arrangement, not Sunwoo. Not even my husband. Just a word for a problem that had been solved. I smiled anyway. I always smiled anyway. It had become something like armor. One night, about 10 days in, I found him at the kitchen counter at nearly midnight. His sleeves rolled up, a tumbler of something amber in front of him that he hadn't touched. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen from him yet. Not the sharp, composed tiredness of a man who'd had a long day, but something heavier, something that sat in his shoulders like a weight he was used to carrying alone. I almost turned around and left. But then I noticed the cuff of his shirt, torn at the seam, hanging loose against his wrist. "You'll ruin that shirt if you don't fix it soon," I said, before I could stop myself. He looked up at me like he'd forgotten I lived there. "I can buy another shirt," he said. "That's not the point." I was already crossing the kitchen before I decided to. Sit still. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the quiet or the late hour or the particular exhaustion in his face that made him look, for just a moment, like someone I might have wanted to take care of under different circumstances. I found the sewing kit in the drawer where I'd unpacked it my first week, and I knelt slightly at his side, taking his wrist gently in my hand to steady it. His skin was warm, warmer than I expected. My fingers brushed his pulse point as I turned his hand, and I felt it jump, quick, sudden, beneath my touch. Neither of us said anything. I could feel him watching me as I worked the needle through the fabric, and the silence between us had a texture to it I hadn't felt before. Not the cold, careful silence of strangers, but something closer, something that made my own pulse climb into my throat. His breath was slow and even beside me. But I noticed his other hand had curled slightly against the counter, like he was resisting the urge to move it somewhere else. "There," I said, finally tying off the thread. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. "It's fixed." He didn't pull his hand away right away. For one long, suspended second, his fingers shifted beneath mine. Not quite a grip, not quite nothing, and I felt my whole body go still, waiting, hoping, my heart slamming so hard I was sure he could hear it in the silence of the kitchen. His eyes met mine, dark and unreadable, but there, for the first time since the wedding, there was something in them. Something that looked almost like hunger, quickly swallowed. Then his jaw tightened, and he pulled his hand back like my touch had burned him. "Don't do that," he said. My chest tightened painfully. "Do what? Fix your shirt? Play house?" His voice had gone cold again, the warmth from a moment ago sealed shut like it had never existed. "I don't need you fussing over me like we're something we're not." I sat back on my heels, the needle still loose between my fingers, and felt something small and hopeful in me curl up and go quiet. "I wasn't trying to be something we're not," I said. "I was just fixing a shirt." "Then fix it and go to bed." He stood, taking the tumbler with him, though he still hadn't drunk from it. At the doorway, he paused, just for a second, just long enough that I almost thought he might say something else. Something that would undo the last 30 seconds. Instead, he said, "You don't have to wait up for me." "I don't want you to. I don't want you to." I sat alone in the kitchen a long time after he left, staring at the amber liquid still sitting untouched on the counter, and thought about the way his pulse had jumped under my fingers, the way his eyes had looked at me like I was something dangerous. He didn't want me to wait up. But some foolish, stubborn part of me, the part that still hadn't learned its lesson, decided I would anyway. I lay there a long time listening to the city outside, cars, distant laughter, someone's music through a thin wall, and told myself this was simply what a marriage like mine would look like. Room shared, name shared, nothing else. I didn't cry. I want that on record, even now. I didn't cry that first night. I just lay very still, staring at the ceiling of a house that wasn't mine, married to a man who had already told me, in his own careful, deliberate way, exactly how little I would ever mean to him. I had no way of knowing yet how much worse it would get before I finally stopped waiting for it to get better. By the second week, I had learned the shape of his absence better than the shape of him. I learned that he left the house at 6:40 every morning. That he took his coffee black with no sugar, and that he hated when the household staff spoke to him before he'd had his first cup. I learned all of this not because he told me, but because I watched, quietly, the way you learn the habits of a stranger you're desperate to understand. I told myself I was just trying to make things easier. That was the lie I fed myself every morning I got up before dawn to have his coffee ready before he came downstairs. The staff had clearly been given some kind of instruction about me, though no one ever said it outright. I noticed it in small things. The way Auntie Park, who ran the kitchen, would answer my questions politely but never warmly, like she'd been told not to get attached to something temporary. I noticed it when JL introduced me to his father's business partner at the door, and simply said, "This is the arrangement my father mentioned," instead of my name.